Welcome to Chemistry for Consumers with an Art Focus. In this particular screencast, we are going to talk about the scientific method as well as start to introduce the idea of how chemistry and art are entwined. As we go through this course, we are going to talk about dyes, and so dyes are generally used to change fabrics different colors. We're going to talk about pigments, which can be mixed with binders to form paints. We're also going to talk about color and light. We're also going to end up talking about metals and ceramics and glass. So you'll get a great overview of the different ways that chemistry affects the field of art. So before we get started, we're going to talk about chemistry and kind of what chemistry is. So chemistry is the study of matter. And how it changes. And I'm a huge why person, and so one of the questions I like to ask myself is, why should we study it? Why should we be interested in chemistry? And the answer is really that it's all around us. It's used in healthcare, to design materials, right? In art, in the environment, or environmental analysis particularly, right? Forensics, right, etc. So chemistry is really all around us, and so by understanding a little bit of chemistry, it can really help us understand some of these other topics. So chemists and all scientists really use the scientific method, and so that's where we're going to start with our introduction here to chemistry. So the scientific method, when we think about this, I really like this flow chart here. What we do is we collect information, and we do this by making observations and doing experiments. We formulate a hypothesis, right? We test the hypothesis with experiments, and then we formulate a theory based on the most successful hypotheses, and then we repeatedly test that theory. So if we are just starting, right, we are going to really collect information via observations, not so much through experiments, but through observations. So when we talk about observations, when we're trying to come up with a hypothesis and we're making these observations, we really want to organize them by patterns. So we're going to organize them by identifying different patterns. And then we want to ask why. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do in the scientific method is we are going to develop a hypothesis. And this explains the observation in some way. Now, a sticking point of this is that you can't prove a hypothesis. You can collect data that supports your hypothesis, but you can't prove it. You can only disprove a hypothesis. So once you have a hypothesis, you need to design an experiment that will test it. When you're undergoing your experimental design, it's really important to only change one variable at a time. Okay. Now, when we talk about variables, there are two different types of variables that we can talk about. One is the independent variable. Okay. And this is the variable that's changed by the scientist. So when we say we're only going to change one variable at a time, that's the independent variable that we are changing. Now, there's another variable that we talk about when we design experiments, and that's the dependent variable. And this is the variable that changes in response to the independent variable. So I want us to do an example where we identify both the independent and dependent variable. So, for example, there's a statement, time spent studying causes test scores to increase. Right? So when we look at this, we need to ask ourselves, what is the variable that can be changed by the scientist? And the thing that can be changed by the scientist is the time spent studying. So if you're setting up a study to test to see if more time spent studying causes test scores to increase, you would maybe create 3 groups where one took a test and they didn't have any time to study, one took a test and they had 3 hours to study, and one took a test and they had 6 hours to study, to see if that caused the test scores to increase. So the time spent studying would be what you would be modifying there. So that's the independent variable. And then the thing that you would be measuring to see if it changed would be the test scores. So the test scores are the dependent variable. Now, after we design an experiment and we have our independent variable and our dependent variable, and we get data from that experiment, then we can look at that data and communicate our results, right? So that's kind of where, when we talk about being scientists, that's kind of where we finish is, we collect the data. And then as scientists, we communicate our results. And we do this, we communicate our results by going to conferences and presenting our results at conferences, or publishing a paper. Now, when we talk about the scientific method more globally, right, we also need to discuss what a law and a theory is. When we talk about a law will summarize a broad variety of observations and experiences. And I said experiences, but I'm going to say experiments. And a really good example of this is if you've had chemistry before and you've talked about gas laws. We have some laws, for example, like Boyle's law, right, that says, hey, look, as the volume of something decreases, the pressure increases, right? It just states something. So there were lots of experiments that showed this. The law summarizes those experiments. Now, you can also have a theory. A theory explains why something happens or makes predictions. And for us in chemistry, one of the big examples of this is atomic theory. And we're going to talk about all of the experiments that led up to our modern atomic theory or our modern understanding of atoms. And we can, and that theory really explains why we see or why atoms act the way they do. Now, this is chemistry and art. So in our introduction here, we also need to talk some about art. And so I'm a chemist by trade. And so when I thought about introducing art into chemistry, and I really had to think about what would my definition of art be. And so I did what a lot of people do is I went to Webster's dictionary and I wanted to know the official definition of what art is. So if you go to Webster's dictionary, it says, hey, look, art is an expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. Right? And so when we think of art, we may think of the art that we've experienced before that we've done, right? So we may think of things that we color. We may think of things that we paint. Maybe we think of fine art. This is the Wheat Stacks by Claude Monet. We might think of modern art. And so this is an example of modern art that's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Maybe we think of Picasso. This is Girl Before Miro by Pablo Picasso. So there's lots of different things that we could think of here. We might think of metallurgy. We might think of jewelry design. We might think of ceramics. We might think of glass. There's lots and lots of different definitions of art. But what I was really interested in is how art and science are similar. And so as I was looking through this, I found this quote by Jacob Bronowski. And it says, science is nothing else than the search to discover unity in the wide variety of nature, or more exactly, in the variety of our own experience. Poetry, painting, the arts are the same search. And Coleridge phrase for unity and variety. And this is a book that was written about science and human values, and he references Coleridge here. Coleridge was the person he's talking about there is a guy by the name of Samuel Coleridge. And he was a poet, and he's referencing his lecture on what the arts are that he made in 1818. And his, of course, primary art was writing. But when I think about science and particularly how beautiful it is, I think about things like gemstones, right, and why they get their color. And then a lot of my graduate work was done on diatoms, which are small organisms that live in the ocean, and they make these beautiful three-dimensional structures. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. So as we go through this course, my hope is that you'll see how science and art are intertwined, and we'll be able to talk about it some.